In this video, we'll break down Carl Jung's insights into why spiritual awakening often leaves you with no motivation, why the goals that once drove you lose their meaning, why everyday life feels strangely empty, and why this loss of drive is not failure, but a hidden part of transformation. Jung understood that when consciousness expands beyond the ordinary, the ambitions of the old self dissolve, making space for something far deeper to emerge. But then, slowly, something else crept in. Not peace, not bliss, fear, raw, primal terror that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. It started small, maybe a flutter of anxiety when you closed your eyes to meditate. Then it grew, a creeping dread that would wake you up at 3 a.m., heart pounding, mind racing with questions you couldn't answer. You started questioning everything. Not in that curious, seeking way you used to, but in a panicked, desperate way. The ground beneath your spiritual feet felt unstable, like walking on ice that might crack at any moment. You began to wonder, am I losing my mind? What if I go too far? What if I can't come back? What if I'm not strong enough for this? What if awakening breaks me? There's a cruel irony here. We expect spiritual awakening to bring us peace, to resolve our inner conflicts, to finally give us the answers we've been seeking. But for many, especially the sensitive ones, the deep feelers, the natural mystics, the ones who feel everything intensely, it brings the opposite. It terrifies us in ways we never imagined possible. I remember speaking with a client, Sarah, incredibly intuitive, 15 years of meditation practice, devoted to her spiritual path with a kind of dedication that impressed everyone around her. She'd read all the books, attended countless workshops, could speak fluently about non-duality and consciousness. Then she had a breakthrough experience during a 10-day silent retreat. She described feeling her boundaries completely dissolve, experiencing herself as pure awareness, witnessing the arising and passing of thoughts and sensations without any sense of personal ownership. She felt, for the first time, what the mystics had been pointing toward. 2 weeks later, she was calling me in tears, having panic attacks every morning before work. She told me, I used to be afraid of not being spiritual enough, of missing out on enlightenment, of wasting this lifetime. Now I'm afraid of being too spiritual. What if I lose myself completely? What if I can't function in the world anymore? What if my family thinks I've lost my mind? What if I have lost my mind? Carl Jung, the pioneering depth psychologist who mapped the territories of the human psyche like no one before or since, understood this terror intimately. He didn't call it spiritual fear in the way we might today, but he knew exactly what happens when the unconscious floods the conscious mind too quickly, when the ego encounters forces far greater than itself. Jung wrote, "The confrontation with the unconscious must be understood as a religious experience." But he also warned that this experience could be overwhelming, even dangerous, if not properly integrated or approached without adequate preparation. Jung himself went through what he called his confrontation with the unconscious between 1913 and 1919. He described descending into what felt like madness, encountering archetypal figures, experiencing visions that challenged everything he thought he knew about reality. He kept detailed records of this journey in what would later become known as the Red Book. And here's the crucial part. Jung was terrified. This brilliant psychiatrist, this pioneer of human consciousness, was gripped by the same primal fear you're experiencing now. He wrote in his journal, "I was living in a constant state of tension. Often I felt as if gigantic blocks of stone were tumbling down upon me." This wasn't metaphorical for Jung. He genuinely feared for his sanity, wondered if he would ever return to normal functioning, questioned whether he had opened doors that could never be closed. That beautiful terror you're feeling, it's not a sign you're doing something wrong. It's not evidence that you're spiritually weak or unprepared. It's a sign you're touching something real, something so vast and overwhelming that your ego, your sense of individual self feels like it might dissolve entirely. And in a way, that's exactly what's happening. You're encountering what Jung called the numinous, the divine, the sacred, the absolutely other, and your human psyche is responding the only way it knows how, with awe-inspiring terror. So you're not going crazy, you're not spiritually failing, you're not too sensitive or too weak for this path. You're experiencing what Jung called the numinous terror, the overwhelming fear that comes when we encounter the divine, the infinite, the absolute truth of our being that dwarfs everything we thought we knew about ourselves. This terror is as old as human consciousness itself. Every mystical tradition has warnings about it, though they rarely make it into the Instagram quotes. But here's what absolutely no one tells you about this phase. What gets glossed over in spiritual communities, what even experienced teachers sometimes minimize. This fear might be the most important guardian on your spiritual path. It might be the very thing that determines whether your awakening becomes a genuine transformation or a psychological catastrophe. And here's where it gets even more complex and fascinating. Jung discovered that this terror serves multiple functions simultaneously. It's not just random psychological noise. It's your psyche's sophisticated early warning system, your inner wisdom's way of saying, slow down, integrate, prepare yourself for what's coming. Before we continue, if you're someone who's navigating the deeper, more challenging aspects of awakening, make sure to subscribe to Fractal Wisdom. This channel exists to shed light on the parts of spiritual growth that others often gloss over, supporting those brave enough to walk the complete path. So if you've been gripped by unexplainable fear since your awakening, wondering if you've opened a door you can't close, questioning whether you're strong enough for this journey, you're absolutely not alone. You're experiencing a psychological phenomenon that's as ancient as consciousness itself, as universal as breathing, yet as personal as your own heartbeat. A fear so primal it doesn't just challenge your beliefs. It threatens your very sense of existing as a separate self. And here's something crucial that modern spirituality often misses. This fear isn't a bug in the system. It's a feature. It's not evidence that you're doing something wrong. It's evidence that you're doing something incredibly significant, something that your psyche recognizes as potentially life-altering. Let's understand what's really happening at the deepest levels of your consciousness. For most of your life, probably since early childhood, you've operated from what Jung called the ego complex, a clear, bounded sense of who you are. You knew where you ended and the world began. You had an identity, a personality, a coherent story about yourself that allowed you to navigate reality. These weren't illusions exactly. They were necessary psychological constructs, as essential to your functioning as your physical nervous system is to your body. But awakening experiences dissolve those boundaries in ways that can feel catastrophic to the ego. Suddenly, you're not just Sarah, or Mike, or whoever you thought you were. You're experiencing yourself as awareness itself, as the consciousness in which all experience arises and passes away. You might feel yourself expanding beyond the boundaries of your body, merging with the environment around you, or experiencing a kind of cosmic consciousness that makes your personal identity feel like a tiny wave in an infinite ocean. Jung understood that the ego isn't just some false construct to be discarded. It's your survival mechanism, your organizing principle, your psychological immune system. And when spiritual experiences threaten to dissolve it entirely, it fights back with every tool it has. Fear is its primary weapon. This is why you might feel afraid of meditating too deeply, being alone with your thoughts, sleeping because your dreams feel too real, opening up spiritually because you might lose control, going too far into mystical states. Your ego is essentially saying, wait, if we're not separate, if we're all one consciousness, then what happens to me? Do I cease to exist? And here's the thing. This fear is actually intelligent. Jung believed that premature ego dissolution, what he called inflation, could lead to psychological instability. You need your ego structure, at least partially intact, to function in the world. You need to be able to show up for work, maintain relationships, make practical decisions, navigate social situations. The key insight Jung offered wasn't to destroy the ego or transcend it completely, but to transform your relationship with it, to help it understand that awakening doesn't mean annihilation. It means expansion and integration. This is where Jung's revolutionary concept of individuation becomes crucial for understanding your terror. True spiritual maturity, according to Jung, isn't about transcending the ego or dissolving into some blissful state of oneness. It's about integrating the ego into a larger, more complete sense of self, with a capital S, that can hold both human and divine experience simultaneously. That can be both individual and universal, both personal and transpersonal. But before you can reach that integration, before you can develop what Jung called the transcendent function, you often have to move through this valley of terror. You have to feel the full impact of what awakening really means, not just intellectually, but viscerally, in your bones, in your nervous system, in the very core of your being. And Jung had very specific insights about how to navigate this terrifying passage safely and consciously, without getting lost in either spiritual bypassing on one side or psychological fragmentation on the other. There's a phase after awakening that spiritual teachers rarely discuss openly, and when they do, they often minimize it or rush through it as if it's just an inconvenient obstacle to overcome. It's not the blissful unity experiences you see described in spiritual memoirs. It's not the peaceful surrender depicted in meditation apps or the serene enlightenment portrayed in ancient texts. It's the raw, unfiltered terror of ego death, while you're still fully alive, still having to pay bills, still needing to show up for your family, still living in a world that doesn't understand what you're going through. Carl Jung called this the encounter with the numinous, the overwhelming, often traumatic experience of touching something so much greater than yourself that your ordinary sense of identity feels utterly insignificant, like a grain of sand facing an infinite ocean. He wrote about it extensively, not as pathology or spiritual crisis, but as a necessary and inevitable stage of psychological and spiritual development, as unavoidable as puberty if you're truly committed to growing into your full potential as a conscious being. But here's what makes this phase so confusing and destabilizing. The terror often comes in waves, seemingly triggered by nothing at all. You might be doing something completely ordinary, washing dishes, driving to work, having a casual conversation with a friend, when suddenly you're gripped by existential terror, so profound it takes your breath away. Not fear of dying, but fear of never having existed as a separate being at all. Not fear of the unknown, but fear of knowing too much, of seeing too clearly, of understanding something that can never be unseen. This is what Jung called ontological anxiety, the fear of non-being, of dissolution, of losing the very foundation of what you thought was real and solid and permanent. It's the terror of recognizing that everything you've built your life around, your achievements, your relationships, your goals, your very sense of self might be no more permanent or substantial than a dream you're in the process of waking up from. And it's actually a sign that your consciousness is expanding beyond its previous limits, like a snake that has to shed its skin or a butterfly emerging from its cocoon. The old container of your identity simply can't hold the new level of awareness you are accessing. The ego experiences this expansion as death because, in a very real psychological sense, it is death. Not physical death, obviously, but the death of the illusion of separation, the death of the limited identity you've carried since childhood, the death of the story you've been telling yourself about who you are and what life is about, and your psychological system, which has spent decades maybe your entire lifetime, building and maintaining and defending that illusion, naturally resists with everything it has. This resistance isn't personal weakness or spiritual failure. It's a perfectly intelligent survival response. Your psyche is essentially saying, this expansion is happening too fast. This transformation is too radical. I need time to adjust, to integrate, to find a new way of organizing experience that doesn't result in complete dissolution. This is why so many people who have powerful awakening experiences then spend months or even years afraid to go deeper, afraid to meditate, afraid to be alone with themselves, afraid of anything that might trigger another breakthrough. They're not being resistant or spiritually immature or cowardly. They're being psychologically intelligent. Their system is saying, slow down, let me catch up, let me find a way to expand without completely dissolving into chaos. Jung believed this fear served a vital protective function. It prevents what he called psychotic inflation, getting so identified with cosmic consciousness, with divine awareness, with universal truth, that you lose your ability to function in ordinary reality. He treated numerous patients who had touched transcendent states but couldn't integrate them properly, leading to grandiosity, messiah complexes, complete disconnection from other people, or total withdrawal from practical life. These weren't spiritually advanced beings who had transcended the need for worldly engagement. These were people whose psyches had been overwhelmed by experiences they weren't prepared for, like trying to pour an ocean into a teacup. The fear you're experiencing is your teacup saying, wait, let me expand gradually so I can actually contain this ocean instead of being shattered by it. The fear is your psyche's way of maintaining balance, of ensuring that your spiritual development serves your overall human development rather than undermining it. It's asking the essential questions. How can I be both human and divine? How can I be both individual and universal? How can I touch the infinite without losing my ability to love specific people, to care about particular things, to have preferences and boundaries and relationships? And here's the beautiful paradox that Jung understood so clearly. The very fear that seems to be blocking your spiritual progress is actually guiding it. It's forcing you to develop what Jung called the transcendent function, the psychological capacity to hold opposites in creative tension rather than choosing one over the other or trying to resolve the paradox prematurely. You don't have to choose between being spiritually awake and psychologically stable. You don't have to choose between mystical experience and human functionality. You don't have to choose between cosmic consciousness and personal identity. The fear is teaching you to find what Jung called the middle way, a path of being that honors and integrates both dimensions of your experience. But how do you actually work with this terror constructively? How do you move through it without being overwhelmed by it or prematurely shutting it down? Jung had very specific recommendations drawn from his own harrowing journey through what he called his confrontation with the unconscious, and they might surprise you with their practicality and wisdom. So you've been living with this spiritual fear, this terror of dissolution, this overwhelming sense that awakening might be more than you can handle, and you're probably wondering, when does this end? When do I feel safe in my own consciousness again? When can I pursue spiritual growth without feeling like I'm walking on a tightrope over an abyss? The truth Jung discovered, both through his own experience and through decades of working with patients going through similar crises, is that it doesn't end exactly. It transforms. The fear doesn't just disappear one day. Instead, it evolves into something more workable, more intelligent, more aligned with your actual spiritual development, rather than working against it. And Carl Jung understood precisely how to facilitate this transformation, how to work with the terror instead of against it, how to use it as a teacher, rather than seeing it as an obstacle to overcome or transcend. Jung's approach wasn't to eliminate the fear, which he saw as both impossible and counterproductive, but to develop what he called a conscious relationship with it. He believed that every psychological experience, even terror, even the most uncomfortable and unwanted states, carried important information about your psyche's needs, your developmental process, your soul's deepest concerns. The fear isn't your enemy. It's your psyche's attempt to maintain integration while expanding into larger states of consciousness. It's like a wise teacher who appears harsh on the surface, but whose lessons, when properly understood, guide you toward greater wholeness and stability. Here's Jung's practical wisdom, distilled from years of his own inner work and therapeutic practice. Instead of trying to transcend the fear, suppress it, or push through it with willpower, you learn to dialogue with it. You treat it as an autonomous part of your psyche that has something essential to communicate. You ask it questions with genuine curiosity and respect. What are you protecting? What do you need me to understand? What are you afraid will happen if I continue on this path? How can we expand safely together? What do you need from me to feel more secure in this process? This process Jung called active imagination, consciously engaging with the autonomous contents of the psyche instead of being overwhelmed by them or trying to make them go away. When spiritual fear arises, instead of fighting it or being consumed by it or trying to meditate it away, you become curious about its message, its concerns, its wisdom. Often when you really listen, the fear is saying something like, I need you to stay grounded in your body, in your relationships, in practical reality. I need you to maintain your human connections and responsibilities. I need you to remember that awakening is supposed to serve life, not replace it or escape from it. I need you to go slowly enough that I can integrate these experiences instead of being shattered by them. The fear might be saying, I'm worried you'll become so identified with cosmic consciousness that you'll lose your ability to relate to the people you love. I'm afraid you'll become so detached from personal desires that you won't be able to create anything meaningful in the world. I'm concerned you'll get so absorbed in transcendent states that you'll neglect your health, your work, your family, your responsibilities. Jung discovered that people who successfully integrated profound spiritual experiences, who managed to embody awakening rather than just having peak experiences, had developed what he called a religious attitude, not religious in the dogmatic or institutional sense, but in the sense of approaching the sacred, the numinous, the mystery of consciousness with both reverence and discernment, both openness and wisdom. This means approaching your spiritual development with several key principles that Jung saw as essential. Respecting the power of consciousness, altering experiences without becoming addicted to them, moving slowly and deliberately rather than seeking peak states or dramatic breakthroughs, maintaining strong, authentic connections to ordinary reality, work, relationships, creativity, service, treating spiritual experiences as sacred communications rather than entertainment or validation, building what Jung called a strong enough vessel, developing a robust enough ego structure to contain expanded awareness without being destroyed by it, integrating each experience thoroughly before seeking the next one, staying embodied, staying relational, staying engaged with the world. The fear begins to transform when you prove to your psyche, through your actions and choices, that you can touch the infinite and return fully to your humanity. Each time you have a profound spiritual experience, and then successfully integrate it into daily life, showing up for your responsibilities, maintaining your relationships, staying grounded in your body, using the insights to serve others, rather than just feeding your ego, the fear lessens its grip. It's not that you become fearless in some heroic or reckless way. It's that you develop what Jung called conscious fear, a respectful, intelligent, collaborative relationship with the vastness of consciousness rather than a panicked, reactive, adversarial one. You learn to say to the fear, I hear you. I respect your concerns. Let's work together. Show me how to expand in a way that serves the totality of who I am, not just the part of me that wants transcendent experiences. Eventually, over months or sometimes years of this kind of conscious collaboration, the fear transforms into something that feels more like excitement. Not the ego's excitement about spiritual achievements or getting somewhere special, but the soul's excitement about participating consciously in the great mystery of existence while remaining fully, gloriously, unapologetically human. This is when awakening becomes sustainable, when you're no longer afraid of losing yourself in spiritual states because you've learned to dance between dimensions, touching the transcendent and returning to the personal, accessing unity consciousness and maintaining healthy boundaries, experiencing yourself as infinite awareness while still enjoying your morning coffee. Jung called this the realization of the self, not the small self of personality, but the capital S self that can hold all contradictions, all experiences, all dimensions of being, without being threatened by any of them. If you've been gripped by spiritual fear, you're not regressing. You're not doing anything wrong. You're in one of the most sacred phases of consciousness development, the phase where you learn to be both human and divine, simultaneously. The fear is your teacher, showing you how to expand consciously rather than recklessly. And when you learn its lessons, when you prove you can be trusted with greater and greater states of awareness while remaining grounded and functional, it transforms from terror into wonder. This isn't the end of your spiritual journey. It's where you finally begin to live your awakening instead of just experiencing it. You become someone who embodies transcendence rather than just visiting it. If this resonated with you, if it helped you understand something you've been struggling with in silence, I'd love to hear your experience in the comments below. And if you want more content that explores the real, unfiltered aspects of spiritual growth, the challenging parts that make you stronger and wiser, make sure to subscribe to Fractal Wisdom. Because true awakening isn't about having mystical experiences. It's about becoming someone strong enough, integrated enough, and wise enough to live from that awakened state every single day.